I'm going to talk about policy instruments. We talked extensively about how to set targets for environmental value. I'm going to talk about policy instruments. We talked extensively about how to set targets for environmental policy. We talked extensively about some of the information that flows into the setting of targets. And now we're going to talk about, given that there is a target, how to best achieve that particular goal. Before I'm going to talk about specific policy instruments, I'm going to talk about some preliminaries, particularly the justification for regulation, the policy instruments themselves, and the criteria to evaluate those. The classical economists, Adam Smith and colleagues, argued that the only reason for a government to step into how the market works is for the provision of public goods. And they realized that the government or the market is not particularly good in providing public goods, and they said, well, this is a reason for the government to step in. But later, the neoclassical economists realized that there's also such things as externalities, the unintended impacts of a market action or a market transaction on a third party. And Alfred Picou in particular argued that this is a reason for the government to step in. Much later, economists began to realize that asymmetric information is another justification for government intervention. If the buyer of a product has much less information about that product than the seller, then the market would not result in a Pareto improvement transaction, and therefore the government can step in. Another reason for the government to intervene is if there is a natural monopoly. A natural monopoly occurs when the benefits of competition are much smaller than the costs of providing competition. Examples are the electricity grid or the road network. It would be much better if there were multiple grids, and there would be competition and the price of the electricity would be lower, but the cost of all these cables is so high that the benefits of competition are simply not large enough to justify building a second electricity grid or a third electricity grid. And the same is true for a road network. And in that case, you have a natural monopoly. Monopolists are not particularly good for customers, and therefore it would be welfare improving if the government steps in and controls monopoly power in this case. The same is true for market power that is not natural. There's cartel formation, for instance. Also in those cases, it would be better for social welfare if the government somehow tames market power. These are the 5 accepted reasons for the government to intervene, accepted by economists. That is, non-economists can come up with all sorts of other reasons why the government should intervene in particular cases, but these are the 5 classes of market interventions where an economist, a textbook economist would say, every textbook economist would say, let's have some government interventions. It's important to realize that it is often the case that these market imperfections do not occur in isolation. It is often the case that there's multiple market imperfections. For instance, if you want to regulate energy because of its environmental implications, there is an externality with air pollution or climate change or something like that, then what you would find is that there's also a natural monopoly in the grid and in power generation itself. There's a lot of market power. And that means that the simple regulation that you would do in case of an externality actually would not work, and you need to take into account how the different market imperfections interact with each other, and I'll show a few examples of that later. It's also important to realize, as I said, that there's other reasons why regulation may occur. And sometimes governments act not to improve the welfare of society as a whole, but to improve the welfare of politicians, or the welfare of bureaucrats, or the welfare of the people who donate to political parties. And we put this under the label of rent seeking. And that is something that reduces welfare, and it should be clear that we should try and avoid this sort of behavior. So these are the reasons why you wouldn't want to regulate parts of the market. There's all sorts of things that a government can do if it wants to reduce externalities and improve environmental quality. And I'll talk about these things extensively. The government can just prescribe things. It can tell companies and households what to do, what not to do, how to do it, how not to do it. That falls under the heading of direct regulation. The government can give subsidies to reward environmentally friendly behavior, or it can use taxes to punish environmentally unfriendly behavior. Those are the sort of the two main classes that are there, and then there's a whole bunch of other things that the government can do. And economists being economists, if there's a bunch of things that we don't have a proper label for, then we call it institutional. And that includes direct bargaining between parties, that includes the installation of property rights, that includes voluntary agreements for giving information to people about the environmental consequences of these of their actions. So there's a whole range of things that the government can do, and different regulations, different types of regulation would be suited for different purposes. And therefore it's important to distinguish between the different types of pollutions. So some pollution stays in the environment for a very long time. Other pollutants, other forms of pollution go away immediately. And an example of that is noise. If the activity stops, then the noise is gone. Whereas nuclear waste lingers for thousands or tens of thousands of years. So that's the difference between stock and flow pollution. And we will see that tax instruments are much better suited for stock pollutants, whereas tradable permits are perhaps better suited for flow pollutants. Another distinction in terms of pollution in where it ends up. Does it end up in the water or the air or the soil? And that is of course just important for how it behaves in the environment and the sort of consequences that you can expect. Another important distinction is those types of pollution that come from a particular small number of plants versus that pollution that comes from basically anywhere. And a good example of a point source of pollution is nuclear power. There's only 400 nuclear power plants in the world, and whereas on the other hand there are perhaps 1 billion cars on the planet. And what we will see is that direct regulation can work for point pollution, point sources of pollution, but it's fairly hopeless for diffuse sources of pollution. And there, taxes and subsidies are much better instruments. It's also important to distinguish between that pollution that is spatially concentrated and those forms of pollution that are widespread and basically everywhere and have roughly the same impact everywhere. And that would be true, for instance, for UVB radiation that gives cancer. And that is roughly equally spread across the world and it affects basically everybody the same way. And you can contrast that to nature conservation, where you establish a park, a nature reserve, and that is by definition in one particular location. Now the issue with nature conservation is that if you want to preserve nature in a particular place, then a tax would just not be particularly suitable, because that would imply that, say, a tax on development only applies in the South Downs but not elsewhere in Sussex, which just makes it administratively very awkward, and actually it's hard to see how you could write a tax code such that taxes apply in certain locations but not in others. That becomes complicated and awkward. And direct regulation actually can be much more easily location specific. So it's important to keep those things in mind. And then the final distinction that we need to make is between local pollution, regional pollution, continental pollution, and global pollution. And it's just a different set of political and policy actors that come into play. Local pollution is often the county council or even lower authorities that do this. Whereas if you talk about global environmental problems such as climatic change, you almost need the United Nations to do this. And these different political actors or these different jurisdictions have different instruments at their disposal. Local authorities have very limited range of tax raising powers, but actually have particularly strong powers for direct regulation, whereas global actors have very little power to start with, either over taxation or direct regulation. That they simply cannot do much, and that sort of informs what can be done, and it's a much more pragmatic argument. And it's important to keep things in mind, these things in mind, before you decide on the type of regulation that you're going to go for. Final thing, what we did see is that there's this whole range of policy instruments, and there's all these different sorts of pollution, and you need to somehow combine these two, and that means that you need criteria to say, well, this particular instrument for this particular problem in this particular jurisdiction is better suited. And the 6 criteria that I'm going to talk about are cost effectiveness. Do you meet your target at the lowest possible cost? Administrative costs. Is it expensive to implement, or is it cheap to implement? And this also under that fall the information requirements. Can the government do this cheaply with the information that it has, or does it need to get involved in very expensive information gathering exercise? Another important criterion is environmental effectiveness. Does it actually achieve its goals? Does it actually make the environment cleaner? And an important consideration in that is enforceability. You can come up with a beautiful intervention that works very well in theory, but if it doesn't work in practice, if you cannot cannot enforce the change in environmental behavior in your households or your companies, then it's a pretty hopeless instrument. Fourth criteria is that we should not just focus on the short run, but also focus on the long run. And some policy interventions have equivalent effects in the short run, but the opposite effects in the long run. if we are focusing on the longer term, then we're also pretty sure that we kind of learn new things. Very few environmental problems are known with any sort of degree of certainty. And that means that we will learn things, including things that we did not expect. And that then in turn implies that we need to adjust our behavior. We need to adjust our policy as we discover new things and as circumstances change. And some policy instruments are better suited for changing around than other policy instruments. And the final thing that we need to consider is not just what is the total cost to society, but also who bears those costs. Those are equity arguments, and they are important too.